I was staying with my brother at a small cabin deep in northern Montana. It sat in a low area between two mountains, hidden in thick trees. My brother Johnny and I have always loved the outdoors, so trips like this weren't unusual for us. We liked hiking, camping, and exploring places far from people. Because the drive was long, we spent our first day relaxing. We stayed near the cabin, enjoyed the quiet scenery, and didn't do much else. Around 5:30 that evening, Johnny said he wanted to take a quick walk before dark. I remember barely glancing at him, still tired from driving, and saying, "All right." He didn't take a bag or anything, so I figured it would just be a short stroll. I stayed on the couch by the fireplace. I was half asleep, just enjoying the warmth of the fire while the cabin slowly got darker as the sun went down behind the mountains. Before long, the only light inside came from the fireplace. That's when it hit me. Johnny still hadn't come back. By now it was pitch black outside, way too dark to be walking without a flashlight. Feeling uneasy, I jumped up, grabbed my small day bag, slipped on my headlamp and grabbed a flashlight. We were in bear country, and that was my first thought. I didn't want Johnny to run into a bear alone. But as I started down the trail, my worry began to shift to something else. There was this weird feeling I couldn't shake, like somebody might be behind me. I kept turning my head to check, but no one was there. After about 10 minutes on the trail, I finally saw Johnny coming toward me. He wasn't running, but he was walking fast, like he wanted to get away from something. We both started speaking at the same time. I was asking what was wrong, and he was telling me to go back to the cabin. We stopped talking and just turned around, walking quickly back to the cabin together. Once inside, Johnny told me what had happened. He said he had seen someone standing out among the trees. This person didn't look like a hiker. He looked strange, almost like he was hiding, and Johnny got the sense the man was following him. So Johnny had waited until it got dark before heading back, hoping the guy would lose interest and not follow. Johnny was the older brother, so he tried to reassure me it was probably nothing. Maybe the man had a cabin nearby, or was just another person exploring. I tried to believe him. We made dinner and then sat outside on the porch, by a small campfire. Neither of us admitted it, but I think we were both quietly scanning the tree line, watching for movement. The mountains grew even quieter as night fell. We sat by the fire until late, talking just to pass the time, and then eventually went inside to sleep. In the morning, we had a quick breakfast and set out for the main hike in the area, a trail leading to the top of one of the nearby peaks. It took about 6 hours, and by the time we returned, we were both exhausted. When we got back, Johnny tossed his bag on the floor and said he was going to take a shower. I stayed on the couch. There were only 2 rooms and 1 bathroom, so I had to wait my turn. I lay there for a few minutes trying to rest when I suddenly remembered the man Johnny had seen in the woods the day before. I stood up and looked out the window, half expecting to see someone out there. The trees stood still. I went back to the couch, but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. A couple of minutes passed before I realized something. The sound of the water pump for the shower hadn't started. I called out for Johnny, no answer. I got up and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. I knocked softly and said his name again. That's when something felt very wrong. I slowly reached down, turned the handle, and cracked the door open just a few inches. Through the gap, I could see Johnny. He was kneeling in the corner of the room, eyes wide and fixed on me, shaking his head no, like he was telling me not to come in. The fear on his face was unlike anything I've ever seen. I pushed the door open wider and saw him. A man was standing only a few feet from my brother. His eyes were wide, but in a disturbing, empty way. His clothes were ripped and dirty. His long black hair looked greasy and unwashed. I didn't even have time to think. I just reacted. I lunged at him. As I got closer, I saw him start to lift a gun from his side. Somehow, I reached him before he could point it at me. I tackled him hard. Johnny instantly jumped up to help. We wrestled the gun out of his hands and tried to pin him down. The man was wild, almost animal-like, screaming and clawing at us as he tried to get free. I'd never seen anything like it. He didn't stop fighting no matter what we did. We needed a plan. Johnny, who was stronger than me, told me he'd hold the man down while I got the car ready. I ran out to the car, tossed our bags inside, they were still packed from the hike, and turned the engine on. Then I hurried back in. We tied the man up with whatever we could find, bits of rope, cords, anything, just enough to hold him long enough for us to escape. We took the gun with us and ran out, slamming the door. As we drove away, we could hear him screaming inside the cabin. Once we reached an area with phone service, we called the police. But by the time they got to the cabin, the man was gone. The scraps we had tied him with were still on the floor, but he had disappeared. Later, Johnny told me what had happened. When he went into the room to shower, the man had surprised him and held him at gunpoint. He told Johnny to call me into the room, but Johnny refused, knowing it would put me in danger. But then I had walked in anyway. We still talk about how crazy it was that I tackled him. I can't even explain what made me do it, but it may have saved both of us. The police were able to trace the gun we gave them. It had belonged to a man who'd gone missing 5 years earlier, about 50 miles from where we were staying. But from the way we described the person who attacked us, it didn't sound like the missing gun owner. It was probably someone else entirely. We believe the man who attacked us must have taken the gun from the missing person, maybe even hurt him. Which means if things had gone even slightly differently, my brother and I might have been his next victims. Even now, thinking about that night at the desolate cabin in the woods gives me chills. In 2016, I decided to take a trip to my father's old cabin. It sat deep in the woods, about 6 hours from where I lived, near the place he grew up. That place wasn't even a town anymore. Just a few empty buildings and boarded-up stores sitting on a deserted road. We almost never went to his cabin because he always said there was no reason to after the town died out. But after he passed away, I felt like I needed to go there. I wanted to see the place he built with his own hands. I knew it would probably be falling apart, but I thought maybe I could fix it up a little and keep it standing, at least as a way to hold on to it. Mostly, I hoped the trip would give me some quiet and clear my head. I drove out there and parked my car behind one of the old abandoned gas stations. From there, I followed the thin, rugged trail through the woods for about 2 miles to reach the cabin. I carried all my backpacking gear and the tools I thought I'd need. Part of me wondered if the cabin had already collapsed, so I'd even packed a tent just in case. When I finally stepped into the small clearing, I was surprised to see it still standing. It was a plain, rectangular log cabin, covered with vines and green moss climbing the outer walls. When I pushed the door open, I saw there were no locks on it. The inside was in terrible shape. Trash was scattered on the floor, and the air smelled damp and musty. It was obvious someone had used it at some point, probably a long time ago, but not recently. It looked like no one had been there in a couple of years at least. I shoved the trash into a corner to make space and laid out my gear. With the sun already going down, I unrolled my sleeping bag and decided to settle in for the night. Even though it was quiet, I couldn't sleep for more than half an hour at a time. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up with a strange, uneasy feeling, like something wasn't right. It was one of the worst nights of sleep I've ever had. At sunrise, groggy and second-guessing why I'd come at all, I fired up my small camping stove and made some coffee. Then I went for a walk to clear my head. The woods were still dim, with only a few streaks of sunlight cutting through the trees. Eventually, I found a small hill that rose above the tree line. It looked like a good spot to watch the sunrise, but what I saw instead stopped me. From the top of the hill, I could see the abandoned town far off in the distance, and there, faint but clear, was a light glowing from one of the buildings. It looked like it was shining from a window. A moment later, it went out. I couldn't tell if it was a house or an old shop, but someone was definitely there. For a second, I worried about leaving my car down there, but mostly I was shocked anyone else would be out in this area. I tried to tell myself it was probably just some explorers or maybe a drifter. Still, it felt like a strange coincidence. I sat on the hill for about an hour, watching the sun slowly rise. Then I walked back to the cabin to start working. I began cleaning up the outside, scraping and sealing where I could. But the whole time, that same uneasy feeling from the night before kept creeping up on me. Every time I glanced at the tree line, it felt like someone might be watching. It took me a while to really understand the feeling, but eventually I realized what it was. I didn't feel alone out there. I tried to shake it off and keep working, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. It didn't even seem possible for someone else to be out here. The town, maybe, but not this random spot in the woods where only an old rotting cabin stood. I told myself I was just on edge for no reason. When the sun went down, I went inside and tested out the old wood stove. To my surprise, it still worked perfectly. It heated up fast, the flames crackling in the quiet room. I sat by the fire and stared into it, thinking about my dad, the cabin, and this strange trip. Then I heard it. A faint crunching sound outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the closer it got, the more I knew it wasn't. The sound was too steady, too heavy. Someone was walking toward the cabin. Just as whoever it was reached the front door, the sound of the stove seemed to grow louder, almost drowning everything out. Then came a knock, and a voice calling out a name. My dad's name. For a moment I froze. Hearing his name out here hit me like a shockwave. I got up and moved quietly to the other side of the door. How did this person know my father? Against my better judgment, I called back, asking who he was. The man paused, as if realizing I wasn't the one he expected. I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin, he said. Was hoping to see him again. I stepped a little closer to the door. A part of me wanted to open it, to talk to someone who knew my dad, to hear stories about him. But something felt off. Why was this man here now? Why had he come out of the woods at night? I asked where he lived, and he said he stayed in the old town nearby. I hesitated, then told him my father had passed away. The man went silent for a moment. I'm real sorry to hear that, kid. Wish I could have seen him one more time. At first, his words felt comforting, but something about his tone didn't match. It wasn't the sadness I expected from someone who just found out their friend was gone. Before I could even respond, he spoke again. Why don't you open up and we can have a chat? It's real cold out here. Would be nice to share that fire. His voice was slow, but I could hear a kind of impatience under it. My gut told me he wasn't who he said he was. Sure, he knew my dad's name and the town he used to live in, but that didn't mean he was really a friend. I couldn't think of what to say next. In the silence, the man asked again for me to open the door. He knocked harder this time. His voice shifted, sounding less polite, more demanding. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding. Kid, open the door, he said. You gonna let me die out here in the cold? That what your father would want? My hands shook as I dug through my backpack for my hunting knife. The man kept hitting the door, his words turning into subtle threats, the fake friendliness slipping away. This went on for what felt like forever, like some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then suddenly, he slammed the door with his fist, and I heard footsteps moving away, fading back into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night, wide awake, heart racing, waiting for him to come back. When the sun finally rose and everything was silent, I quickly packed my bag and left the cabin. I ran through the woods, hoping I wouldn't see him again. My car was still there, hidden behind the crumbling gas station. Nothing had been touched. I jumped in and drove off without stopping. I thought going there might give me some kind of closure about my dad, but instead, I left with more questions than answers. I realized I didn't really know why he had left that town for good. I always assumed it was because the town was dying and everyone else was leaving, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe there was something else, something he never told me. I don't know why that man was still hanging around, or what he really wanted. I don't know how he knew my dad's name, or what he would have done if I'd opened that door. But deep down, I'm sure of one thing. If I had let my emotions get the better of me and invited him inside, I don't think I'd have made it out of those woods.